Well. Good afternoon, everyone. So nice to see you. Welcome to our spring Chautauqua here at the, we do Chautauquas here at Stanford now, in case you didn't know. Sponsored by the Research Institute for the Center, for the Center of Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. And I'm Prudence Carter. I'm the director, outgoing director, actually. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here all this afternoon. I am really happy to see you and to actually engage with the work we'll be engaging with by Professor Corey Fields. Before I actually do the introductions, I just want to draw your attention to a few things. They're on your table so that you can know how much what else we're doing for the remainder of the quarter, and there are a number of rich things happening, particularly the ninth annual Kiva lecture, which will happen on May 9th here on campus. And this year's speaker is Maxine Hong Kingston, who is a renowned writer. And she is a professor at Berkeley, and she will be here on the 9th from 4 to 5:30, and that panel will be moderated by our own Professor Paula Moya in the English department. And then I wanted to ask you to come out for our RICSRI seminar. You know, monthly we have the faculty-student seminars, and this month's speaker is going to be Professor Dara Strolovitz, who is a political scientist who's visiting us this year as a visiting scholar at CSRE. And she's going to be talking about her research, and the title of her talk is When Bad Things Happen to Privileged People, Marginalization, Representation, and the Political Construction of Crisis. So she's really here, and she's here. There she is in the back. Yeah, so we're really happy to have her. And then we have on June 5th, our last one for the year with the sociologist, Professor Carolyn Chin, who will be giving a talk on racial barriers and religious boundaries, religion and assimilation among second-generation Asian Americans. We're really excited about that. And then I want to draw your attention to the annual Ernesto Galarza commemorative lecture. And this year's featured speakers are Arturo Vargas and Ricardo Ramirez, and that's on Tuesday, the 20th of May. At 5 o'clock in Treseder Union. So you'll see the flyer for that too on your table. So we have a number of good talks. We've been having a really rich quarter with a number of visiting thinkers, scholars. Last night, if you missed the St. Clair Drake lecture, you missed it because that was out of this world with Venerable Harry Belafonte, who is perhaps the epitome of what I call an organic intellectual. I mean, it's just amazing that someone could be a high school dropout, and not to centralize or anything or stereotype, but he knows more than the average scholar to whom I talked. I mean, that man was just really bringing it, as the kids say. So, and as I say too. So let me introduce our moderator for the day, and I'm really pleased to introduce Professor Lauren Davenport, who's an assistant professor in our political science department. Lauren's an expert in American politics, public opinion, race and ethnicity, and in particular, her work seeks to problematize the study of racial identity by examining the development of political group consciousness among those in the U.S. that we perceive as mixed race populations. She is working on a book project herself, Politics Between Black and White, and this assesses how social, historical, and economic processes help to construct multiracial identities and political outlook. And she has a number of other ongoing research projects which examine public attitudes towards interracial marriage, the policy ramifications of multi-race identification, and the influence of co-ethnicity on voter support for political candidates. So she is going to come up and introduce our featured speaker for the day. And without further ado, I will yield the podium to her and say, welcome, Professor Davenport. It's nice to have you, and thank you.
Thanks. I'm really excited to be moderating this talk by Professor Corey Fields. African Americans are the most democratic voting bloc in the country. In 2012, 94% of blacks voted Democrat, and this number hasn't changed very much over the past several presidential election cycles. The near universal democratic identification among African Americans begs the question, who are the 6% of blacks voting Republican? While there has been much discussion of this issue, there's thus far been very little theory and empirical analysis that grapples with the subject. In his manuscript, Black Elephants in the Room, Corey Fields sheds new light on this fascinating topic by critically examining how race animates the political behavior of African American Republicans. He assesses the meanings that Black Republicans attach to race and examines the consequences these meanings pose for Blacks' political behavior. Drawing on extensive ethnographic observation and rich, in-depth interviews with Black Republican activists, Professor Fields seeks to answer the following questions. How do racial identity and attitude structure the experiences, behaviors, and ideologies of Black Republicans? In light of the fact that Black Republicans are political minorities within their own racial group and racial minorities within their party, do the politics of Black Republicans run counter to the broader group interests of the African American community? And what are the experiences Blacks face as minorities within the Republican Party? I found this to be an impeccably researched, critically analyzed, very well-written piece of scholarship that will make an important contribution to literatures in sociology and political science. Without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce to you Assistant Professor of Sociology, Corey Fields.
Wow, thanks everybody for coming out, and thanks for that awesome introduction. I wish I had known. I think I can shave off like 5 minutes from what I'm gonna say. And actually I want that. I feel like that's the most concise statement of what the book is up to that I've come across. So yeah, I just wanna thank the CCSRE Fellows Program for including me this year. It's been great to be included with Hazel and Richard, and the appreciation shown towards the work. And these events are really awesome, both from in terms of the community building standpoint, but also getting to hear what your colleagues are up to, and selfishly just to learn more about the world, actually. It's actually been really fun to talk about ideas with people, really smart people. So, and for me selfishly, actually, I'm really excited to have been a part of this because this, as you guys know, this is a manuscript in process. So not only do I get to get positive feedback, I get to get sort of free insight from really smart people to help improve a book project. So anyway, the working title of the book, as Lauren said, is Black Elephants in the Room, and the motivating question behind it is pretty straightforward. I'm interested in how race structures the politics of African American Republicans, and I argue in the book that the answer isn't as straightforward as we might think. So, and I'm sure this is probably more, the vanity of every first-time author, but I like to think of the book as a nuanced telling of two stories. The first is sort of an empirical story of what it's like to be Black and Republican, and the second, a broader story about race and politics in the contemporary U.S. Empirically, the book lays out the strategies that African Americans use to connect Blackness and Republicanness and the real-world consequences of that strategy. The selections you read focused mostly on that first part of how do people connect being Black and being Republican, and that's what I'll talk about today. But in the Q&A, we should talk a little bit about sort of the implications of these different strategies and how they play out across a range of political behaviors. But the second, more general point, I think, explores the theoretic and analytic implications of recognizing the various ways that Black people experience being Black. And so, we have a pretty rich descriptive body of literature on like the sort of range of experience that Black people have, but very rarely do we incorporate that knowledge into our analysis of other outcomes, right? So, everyone would look at me crazy if I stood up here and said Black people are a monolith. It's just enough to know that someone's Black. You'd be like, what? Black people are different by class or by race or by sexuality or by gender, right? Yes, I would nod. Yes, I would nod. And then I would look at your models of political behavior or your models of economic outcomes, and what I would see would be a dichotomous understanding of Black. You either are or you aren't. And so what I want to do with the project is actually sort of explore how the variation in how Black people think about being Black actually impacts various political behaviors. And in doing so, I hope, to show the relevance of meaning and meaning making in thinking about race and politics. And so for me, it's actually a really interesting time to be writing about Black Republicans. The leaders of the party are grappling with this need to reach out to what they're calling non-traditional audiences, or what we can think about like people other than old white dudes, right? An obvious focus of these conversations has been Latino voters and women voters, but the conversation has also included a conversation about Black voters and, to a much lesser extent, gay and lesbian voters. But what's interesting about these conversations is that they're always structured around what you can think about as like an intake problem, right? There's always this question of how do we get more Black people into the party, right? How can we make more Black people Republican? And it's an interesting question, and it's a reasonable one because when you think about it, it's a very small number, as Lauren said, right? But I think stating the question that way actually obscures the experience of people already in the funnel, right? And actually sort of understanding what's happening to people within the party helps you understand why there aren't more, I would argue. And so one of the things I want to do with the book is to reorient this discussion. So my project focuses more on the experience and justifications of African American Republicans. And if people are interested, I can talk in the Q&A about some of the pathways into the party and share a little bit of the analysis of some survey data that gives some like correlates of Republican partisanship among Blacks around demographic factors. But I like to think of the book as being less focused on the question of, why are Black people Republican, and more engaged with sort of what's it like to be Black and Republican, right? And those are related questions, but different. So if you're looking for a manual on how to get more Black people into the Republican Party, or as I suspect for most people in this audience, how to stop it, right? This probably isn't going to be the book for you. Okay, so the experience of being Black and Republican is fundamentally shaped by the idea that racial identity is supposed to drive political behavior. And for African Americans, Republican affiliation betrays a lack of group identification. Right? And as I argue in chapter 2, this perception animates responses to African American Republicans across the political spectrum and across like different racial groups, right? And in a conversation with one of my informants, Boyd, he lays out how he thinks other Black people see him. Everybody knows Black Republicans are Uncle Tom, selling out other Black folks. They don't care about Black people. They want to be white. They desperate for white folks to love them. And then he laughs. I've heard it all, and most of it from Black people. And then, he pauses. This is a dramatic pause, right? Sort of. But seriously, though, I'm nobody's Uncle Tom, right? And so this sort of reaction is emblematic of what I would call the sellout critique that positions African American Republicans as being marginal to the Black community, right? And it's pretty common. So, right, sort of an visual representation of the sellout critique. And according to this critique, African American Republicans are somehow inauthentic as Blacks, since supporting the Republican Party is perceived as working counter to the interests of African Americans as a group. Right? Now, the sellout critique is not the only reaction that African American Republicans must grapple with. So white Republicans also react to them. And, Buddy explained to me that how he can talk with a white Republican for like 45 minutes to an hour, and the whole time we're vibing and feeling each other on all kinds of issues. But you can see it in the back of their eyes. It's like they've been holding back, wanting to ask about the one issue they want to know your opinion about: affirmative action. I swear, you can talk to a white Republican all day, but until you pass the affirmative action test, they're going to always be looking at you sideways, right? And so I would argue that this is representative of what I call the skeptical embrace that African American Republicans get from their white Republican counterparts. And the logic behind that skeptical embrace is that there's this expectation that race is supposed to weigh on political decision making, right? So in the end, there's this sense that you can't really trust a Black Republican because at some point they're going to choose race over partisanship, right? And this skepticism was perhaps most famously expressed by Republicans in reaction to Colin Powell's endorsement of Barack Obama. So everyone's favorite Republican, Rush Limbaugh said after the endorsement, Secretary Powell says his endorsement is not about race. Okay, fine. I'm now researching his past endorsements to see if I can find all the inexperienced, very liberal white candidates he has endorsed. I'll let you know what I come up with, right? And the idea here, right, is that, Colin Powell is only supporting Barack Obama because he was black. If Barack Obama were white, Colin Powell would have nothing to do with him, right? And this idea that ultimately, when it comes down to black people, it's going to come down to race. And this sort of haunts white Republicans and shapes the experiences that black Republicans have within the party, right? And actually, in terms of the audiences they're most sort of forced to grapple with, it's rarely black people who are sort of forcing the sellout critique. I mean, that happens, but that's not really sort of primarily what they're responding to. The sort of most frequent responses are to this white skepticism, right? Partly because white Republicans hold the resources, right? Both material and symbolic. They're the gatekeepers of party success. So that's who you have to get through to. Whereas black people are going to pretty much calling you an Uncle Tom and writing you off, right? There's sort of, because of your affiliation with Republicans, there's not that much to be gained from a political and material level. I mean, there's, as you see in the chapter, a lot more sort of psychological. Like, it'd be nice if your family didn't think that you were a sellout. But your family's not going to fund your, political conference on like restoring the black family, right? That's going to be white Republicans. But I'd argue that both the skeptical embrace and the sellout critique are undergirded by a logic that assumes group membership drives political decision making. And we can think about this as sort of an identity model, where the presence of an identity drives political behavior. And frequently, analysts will talk about the concept of linked fate, right? Or the extent to which a black person feels like what happens to them is linked to what happens to black people as a group. And it sort of, gets modeled pretty straightforwardly, where like racial group membership is associated with various political behaviors. And this is a lively body of work, partly because it's empirically borne out, right? And a lot of most analysis of black political behavior, researchers consistently find a connection between racial identity and the political behavior of African Americans. And so I would argue that this is actually the same thinking we see in relation to African American Republicans, right? Like, it's not surprising that their experiences that are what they are, right? They're sort of mirrored in both academic and popular assumptions about how race and politics are supposed to work, particularly for black people, right? And as sort of a sidebar, I think this is the identity model, while present across different racial and ethnic groups, has its most strength and like sort of most dug in when it comes to thinking about black politics, right? Like, we don't really think about, well, increasingly we're starting to think about white people's whiteness is sort of connected to various political behaviors, but it hasn't taken hold in the same sense that we think about, oh, you tell me that someone's black, and now I know enough to like give you a rich account of what their politics are going to be like. So, for the sellout critique, only someone without black identity could be Republican, right? But for the skeptical embrace, no one who holds it could be, right? So in both of these sort of responses, there's this assumption that black Republicans are sort of, black in name only, right? However, I would argue that given the increasing variance in what you could call the black experience, analysts can no longer assume that shared identity equates to shared experiences. And furthermore, feeling a sense of group membership could be experienced in many different ways, right? Like, you could understand your linkage to other black people as a positive that emboldens you and sort of sets you up to, do things that maybe you couldn't otherwise do if you felt like alone, right? Not a member of a group. But you could also perceive it as a constraint, right? That limits your individual expression, something that holds you down, keeps you back from doing what you want to do, keeps you out of places you want to be in. So I would argue that it's not just enough to know that someone is black, right? Or that someone feels connected to black people. But I would argue, but also argue that more disconcertingly for the analysis of political behavior, we don't really get a sense of how race gets linked to any particular form of politics, right? So knowing that linked fate is correlated with liberal policy preference sheds little light on the processes through which blackness gets linked to those politics. Indeed, it's far from a given that a feeling of linked fate must be associated with liberal policy positions, right? We know, in terms of a lot of specific policy issues, African Americans actually articulate a pretty conservative policy preference, which then raises the question: well, why doesn't that policy preference translate into a particular kind of partisanship? And once you start asking these questions, right, these process issues emerge, and so. While I would argue, while linked fate might be strongly connected with democratic partisanship, intervening mechanisms are required to cement this association. So here, I've highlighted in orange the arrow, making this slide different, which suggests that, we need to get inside the arrow, is essentially what I want to argue with this book, right? And see what's happening in there. And for African American Republicans, I contend that what happens in that arrow involves aligning what it means to be Republican with what it means to be black, right? And that, so we can have to think about the notion of sort of what black politics itself being an achievement, right? Black interests aren't just a given, and the sort of political behaviors that might be associated with them aren't a given, that this is something that happens. So, but before we get there, thinking through this identity model of political behavior, you would assume that African American Republicans express weaker levels of identification, right? But empirically, this just wasn't the case in my fieldwork. Indeed, many black conservatives position their engagement in Republican politics as motivated by a deep and unyielding concern for black people. So, one respondent said, "People think if you've affiliated with the Republican Party, you don't like black people. And that is entirely wrong from my standpoint. I affiliate with the Republican Party because I love black people and I see what is happening to us." Ronald, a political organizer, expressed a similar concern or similar sentiment in a different way by stressing how his politics and activism have always been embedded in black communities. And he said, "I've been involved in the community for all my life at a lower level enough for people to see that, first of all, I'm concerned about the least of all," which I don't know if he intended it, but I love that turn of phrase. First of all, I'm concerned about the least of all. I mean, they want to make Republicans sound like they're all big shots and they're bourgeoisie and everything, but I've always worked in the black community, right? I mean, he would go on and say in that quote, except now he feels like black community organizing is so busy trying to get a government handout that it's not able to do any good for black people, right? But the point here is that he sees what he's doing, his politics, as being about helping black communities, because that's sort of where he's identified and where he's seen himself. And the charge that they're less black is inconsistent with how most African American Republicans see themselves. And this bears out in the analysis of survey data as well. So today I'm talking about the qualitative portions of the research, but I also did an analysis of secondary data sources, the National Election Survey, the National Politics Survey, and even the National Black Election Survey, right? And consistently on it, you don't find, once you control for what I call sort of a orientation or like a consciousness measure, you don't really find any effects for the linked fate measure on predicting partisanship among blacks, right? So black Republicans aren't any more or less racially identified than their Democratic or independent counterparts. So, I mean, that's sort of my way of sort of trying to legitimate Sheila and Ronald here, right? That what I'm saying isn't some quirk, right, around these people that I interviewed. But the logic of both the sellout critique and the skeptical embrace assume Republican partisanship among blacks only makes sense if it's accompanied by an absence of racial identity. But I would argue that knowing that African American Republicans think of themselves as black and are embedded in black communities still leaves open this question of how their partisanship gets linked to this black identification, right? So they're black. Okay, they see themselves as embedded in black communities, and they see what they're doing as being for black people. But why Republican? It doesn't naturally give that it would be. If anything, it's counter to what most other people who make those same claims are doing, right? And so now I want to talk about the different strategies I saw among African American Republicans to make this linkage. So I saw two strategies present among them. One that relies on a colorblindness and another that relies on a race consciousness. The colorblind strategy downplays any racial consequences, beneficial or detrimental, to conservative social policy, and instead focuses on an inherent goodness related to conservative beliefs. The race-conscious strategy embraces conservative social policy precisely because of the perceived benefits to black communities, right? So they're sort of operating in very different sort of ideological statements around conservatism. One that's sort of an ideological purity, and the other that's sort of a racial uplift ideology. And while both strategies are marshaled in support of the same policies, I argue that they rely on very different constructions of black interests, right? So both approaches frame themselves as being good for black people, but what's good for black people very much depended on how African American Republicans define this category, right? And so, a central part of this research involved sort of answering the question, who are black people, right? And then the follow-up to that, what do they need politically? Within each strategy, the removal of this incongruence between blackness and republicanness was contingent on very specific ideas about who black people are and what they need. So I'll talk about the two strategies now. The colorblind strategy resolved the conflict between being black and being Republican, essentially by positing that racial identity is overemphasized, right? So being black and Republican makes sense because race should not be central to how someone should make political decisions. So this is what you could think about as race being culturally important or personally important, but not politically important, right? So, my being black matters to me when I think about what church I want to go to, or even what neighborhood I want to live in, or where I want to send my kids to school, right? Like these people were like, I'm not saying that race doesn't matter. I'm not saying that I think about race in really important ways in my life. It's just that when I think about what's the best tax policy, my being black doesn't factor into that, right? So race is a part of who they are, but not central to how they see themselves across all domains. And so this allows for a foregrounding of other identities, right? Identities that might be a smoother fit with Republican partisanship. So the colorblind strategy, right, is founded on a vision of blacks as operating within what I call sort of this pathological value system that overemphasizes race, the importance of race, and the importance of racial discrimination in black life outcomes. And in turn, this leads to worse outcomes relative to other racial and ethnic groups, right? So blacks fail to embrace traditional values of family, work ethic, and personal responsibility, but then lay the blame at racial discrimination. And what's interesting about this pathologized black subject is how it's often framed as this sort of, in contrast to this idealized historical black past, right? So the current black political subject represents a fallen black people, right? It's like, we haven't always been like this. And usually the source of that corruption is government programs, right? And so this notion that, black people, right, are only pathological because of the negative influence of welfare programs and an expansive state. So, the pathology marks a departure from an idealized past where blacks, even under the crushing force of legalized discrimination, embraced a commitment to work and family and relied on close personal and neighborhood networks in times of need. And so you see, this idea that, there was a time when black folks had to scrimp and scrape just to get by. We had to make it happen by hook or by crook. But those days are in the past, and black folks are still holding on to that, quote, just get by mentality. We've got to want better before we can do better, right? So far from being bound by racism and discrimination, the loss of personal responsibility and self-motivation are the causes of blacks' current position in U.S. society, according to this, race-blind construction of black people. In fact, concern with race and racism is itself characteristic of the pathology of black people. So racism becomes an excuse for individual failings, not a systematic problem that constrains blacks. And so when it comes to opportunities out there are opportunities that black people aren't taking advantage of. It's perpetuated that the white man is against me and I can't do it. Okay, this happened in the past, and there may still be some out there, but you don't see other minorities who come over here. You don't see the Pakistanis or the Arabs or the Mexicans, for that matter, allowing what someone else thinks about them to stop them from doing what they need to be doing. They go around them. They go over them. We need to take some of that mentality. Nobody's going to stop me from my dream. As an interesting aside here, it was primarily among these colorblind African-American Republicans that the sort of specter of the Latino haunted, And this is this idea that, black people better watch out because Latinos are coming up and, they're not going to fall back on the same sort of excuses, and white people like Latino people better anyway, so, black people got to be twice as hard, and black people can't be attitudey towards the Republican Party because if the Republican Party can convince Latinos to come along, they don't have to care about black people, right? And so it's funny, this competition with Latinos to be sort of America's minority, right? Fundamentally energized the discussion of other racial groups among these race-blind black Republicans, right? In contrast, the race-conscious people I'll talk about later would often talk about the sort of any unity that would occur between different racial minorities in the U.S. would be sort of grounded in a shared discrimination experience, right, as opposed to this sort of competition experience. So, anyway, with black people defined this way, sort of pathological, Republican policies are positioned as good for black people precisely because they are immune to the identity politics that bog down the left, right? And so the logic behind this, the way that you can frame this colorblind politics in a language of racial uplift, right, is that the best thing for black people is to stop making everything about race. Nobody wants to talk about race. Talking about race is not doing black people any good, right? And so Republican policies get embraced because of an abstract ideological belief in their rightness, pun intended. It's because they're not aligned with the racialized identity politics that Republican positions are worthwhile. And I'll illustrate this with tax policy. And you can see how a colorblind strategy frames low taxes as a subjective good. I know that some of these policies will help my people. You learn how to use your money wisely and invest it. And I think that once black people start making money, they see the benefits of having money. Again, making money, you see the benefits of having money. And what it does is keep us from the death tax. The government takes 50% or something ridiculous like that. You know what that does? That keeps us from being able to transfer to our children stuff that we want to pass down to them. I think it's a money issue, period. And people try to make it into a black issue, and it's actually a class warfare issue between the haves and the have-nots. And so when we first were having this conversation, I actually thought he was about to invoke this sort of very sort of racial uplift kind of framing with talk of passing stuff down to our kids. But actually, he turns on a dime, right, and shifts it to, it's not about black and white. Like, it's not about race. And to the extent that he invokes any sort of collective identity framing, it's around class, oddly aligning himself with the haves over the have-nots. The other interesting thing about this quote, and sort of this is something that emerges throughout the book, is that I think it would be fair to describe the black Republican activists I spent time with as people into politics, not policy. So these were not policy wonks, as you can tell, with his thinking of that the government takes 50% of all your money in an inheritance tax. But you also see, and now this is something that emerges when I talk about the consequences of these strategies, the embeddedness within a broader conservative language, right? Talking about the death tax instead of the inheritance tax. The penetration into broader conservative networks emerges in a lot of the language that gets used. Simultaneously, I think it would be fair to say, if you're sort of checking for language, the integration into black communities also emerges. So you hear a lot of talk of us and we and my, right? So that's the colorblind strategy, which stands in stark contrast to a race-conscious strategy. And this conscious strategy aims to present conservative social policy as a good thing for blacks as blacks. The racial conscious strategy aims to make Republican politics black politics, right? It offers up the potential for black power through conservative principles. Now, this strategy depends on constructing black people as respectable. And this respectability narrative presents blacks as sharing mainstream values of hard work, traditional families, and patriotism. And here, far from being pathological, right, black people are just as good as everybody else. And the extent to which black people don't conform to this sort of respectable narrative, they're treated as anomalies rather than typical, right? So here, the black subject is your hard-working, working-class guy, right, or a middle-class black person, whereas the black subject for the race-blind people is the guy on the corner, right, whose pants are sagging, and why isn't he at work, and who are his people, right, and like why are they let him out like this? The respectable black subject is a hardworking man. And you notice I'm always talking about men here. So when black Republicans are talking about black people, they're talking about a masculine subject. The problem of black people are the problems that black men face. Now, partly this is a function of all the activists overwhelmingly the activists I talked to were men themselves, right? So respectable blacks, just like everybody else, except not like everybody else. Because black people are subject to blocked opportunities that constrain their life chances that everyone else don't have to face, right? So this is a perspective that acknowledges the black subject has to experience racism and discrimination. So look, I know black people, and the problem isn't that black folks don't want to succeed. We want the same things everybody else does, whether you're black, white, yellow, green, whatever. So the problem is not wanting to do better. It makes me so sick when you get some of our own even saying that. And what's interesting here, and actually, again, this talks to sort of the consequences of the strategies, is you see some of the tensions that occur within black Republicans themselves, right? So one of the really surprising aspects of this research was the extent to which I encountered the language of Uncle Tom Sellout ISM, with black Republicans leveling charges of selling out against other black Republicans, right? And so the, race-conscious black Republicans often found themselves frustrated by the willingness of their race-blind counterparts to offer up this pathological narrative for white consumption. And so the gains of the civil rights movement, while removing legal barriers to black citizenship, didn't end the problem of racism, right? According to this sort of the race-conscious construction of black people. As such, racism still shapes the daily experiences of being black in America. And unlike the pathological account, where black people falter because of personal failings, the respectable account foregrounds blocked opportunities as a driver of black inequality. So another respondent told me, that saying about how black folks got to work twice as hard for half as much? Well, it's still true. Look at Obama. That's a black man that's had every advantage, mainly because he grew up around white folks. But just take the average brother on the corner. He's got the same hope and dreams. He probably wants to be president too, but he can't because he doesn't have opportunities to be all he can be, right? And here you see a black person constrained, right? A black person suffering from blocked opportunities. And so this respectable black subject has an entirely different set of interests than the pathological black subject, right? And so within this respectability narrative, it's in black people's interest to work together and look out for each other. The reality of racism means that blacks can't expect whites to have their interest at heart. And so the best thing that blacks can do is to take care of themselves and their own community. And here you start to see sort of a black nationalism light kind of argument, right? Like it's very much focused on black empowerment within black communities. And I call it black empowerment light because it's not at all radical, right? It's just racialized. These guys aren't interested in overturning systems, right? What they're interested in is Black access to those systems. But even with this radically different imagined community of Black people, the racial uplift folks are supporting the same kinds of social policies. And one of the sort of subtle arguments of the book is that a lot of times in research on sort of ideas and politics, there's this assumption that different ideas lead to different kind of policies, right? So, X welfare policy results from A, ideas about Black people, and Y social policy results from B ideas, right? So different ideas drive different policy outcomes. The Black Republican case is an interesting divergence from that because actually different ideas converge around the same policies. And it sort of illustrates the broad carrying capacity of any policy program, right? And more broadly, that you can do a lot in the name of Black people, right? It can supporting Blacks can be tied to a broad range of policies, but by the same token, the same policies can carry really different imaginings of who Black people are. But to think about these policies and how the race-conscious Black Republicans talk about them, let's go back to taxes. This idea, when taxes are low, that encourages business development and entrepreneurship in Black communities. When taxes are lower, there's more money to encourage business, and that's what we need in our community. All these empty storefronts could be filled with Black-owned companies. Black folks think high taxes are good for social programs, but we're really shooting ourselves in the foot because it doesn't encourage Black businesses. Now, what's interesting about this is I think just in the same way that the Raceblind talk on tax policy illustrates the sort of policy naivete of the colorblind group, I think this is an equally naive take on what low taxes might have, the policy implications of low taxes, only it's framed in a way that's very much explicitly about how low taxes are good for Black people as Black people, right? So again, this is more of a politics, not a policy, right? These aren't policy wonks by any stretch. But this divide between colorblind and race-conscious framing happens across a range of issues. In the interest of time, I won't talk about much, but I'll just pop this up, and you can read that while I go on to wrapping up, I think, because, yeah, time-wise. So we can think about the colorblind and racial uplift strategies as two different ways of resolving the perceived incongruence between being Black and Republican, right? Or two different ways of linking Blackness to Republicanness. And the ideas they have about Black people are critical to this process, I would argue, right? Like, these strategies don't work without very clear constructions of who Black people are. And so your ideas about Black people drive your beliefs about Black interests, which then shape how you frame Republican policies. And so I want to treat policy framings as one of the sort of political behavior outcomes I'm interested in. And the experiences of these Black Republican activists suggest that connection can be made in multiple ways. But both strategies are dependent on constructing the collective Black people into very specific kinds of subject. And what's interesting is that it's easy to reflexively think, oh, the colorblind Black subject is real, like pathological, boo, that's bad. But the race-blind Black subject is totally respectable, like they're the awesome ones. But for me, what I'm struck by is how both have a very narrow construction of what Black people are allowed to be, right? And what their problems can be. So while there sort of is a very obvious, positive tint, negative tint to the difference, what they both do is actually draw a very narrow band around who we are, right? And sort of what we can be. And I mean, this is something actually I'd love to hear more people's thoughts on, because I mean, one of the things that's I'm toying with thinking about for the book is that, is this just a problem of politics, right? Like, to do American politics right now, you can't have complicated, nuanced subjects that are sometimes good, sometimes bad, sometimes need this, sometimes need that, right? That doesn't sell. That's hard to pitch, right? So imagine a complicated Black subject and how you would link them to any of these policies. I got off track there. Just the spirit came over me and I had an insight. someone asked me about organizing among Black Republicans and alliance building during the Q&A, because I don't want to go too far on. And I'll just cut to the conclusions, right? So with the case of African-American Republicans, I want to show in the book that we gain better insight into the process through which Black racial identity gets linked to specific political practices. The findings suggest that focusing too closely on the presence or absence of Black racial identity obscures how African-American Republicans link Blackness to their partisan choices. And so instead, don't think of this as I know it looks like a model, but more of like an idea flow notion. And I want to argue that through examinations of these linkages, right, it requires attending to the meanings and salience attached to racial group membership, not just its presence or absence. Ideas about Black people are a key mechanism in this process. Ideas about Black people structure how Black interests are defined and provide the basis upon which Blackness and Republican partisanship can be connected. And these ideas vary among African-American Republican activists. And I argue in the book that those with the more pathological conception of Black people, though they're in the minority, right? Like I've presented these as sort of two equally occupied spaces, right, strategies. But actually, the race-blind strategy is the minority strategy. Yet, those famed Black Republicans have the most success with their white Republican colleagues, right, a disproportionate amount of success. So they find themselves less vulnerable to the racial anxieties that are associated with the skeptical embrace, right? When Fox News needs a Black Republican, they call the guy who says race doesn't matter, not the guy who says Black power through conservative principles. And with that comes a lot of rewards, right? And a lot of attention. I mean, I joked about writing a paper called, Why Are Black Republicans All So Terrible, right? Because, whenever we encounter a Black Republican, they seem like the worst sort of racism denier, Uncle Tom that you're gonna find, right? But I argue that part of that is the process through which people get selected to be seen by you, right? So if you're not doing a study of Black Republicans, you're not likely to encounter a race conscious uplift Black Republican. You don't find out about a Black Republican until they're plucked into the system. And they only get plucked into the system if they're saying what white Republicans want to hear. And so one of the broader points with the book that I want to make is this notion of how Black people get to talk about Blackness in politics. And partly that's structured by what white gatekeepers want to hear, right? So you only get to talk about Blackness in a way that is consistent with what white Republicans are comfortable hearing and want to promote, which then constrains the story of Black people that's offered up within the Republican Party. This gets exacerbated because most times the white Republicans who are interacting with these Black Republicans don't know any other Black people, right? And so these stories take on this sort of cementing, yes, this is what Black people are like. This is Black people are saying this. This isn't just me and my neighbors talking. My friend from, the party meeting said the same thing. So, that really went off script. Okay, wrapping up. Rather than treat race exclusively as an identity that political actors carry, the book tries to also explore how race works as a system of beliefs and attitudes about Black people as a group. And in the book, I talk about this as thinking about race as an identity, but also thinking about race as a set of ideas, right? We do a really good job of thinking about race as this identity characteristic of individuals, but we don't do as good of a job of thinking about race as a set of ideas. Asterisk, we do actually a surprisingly good job when it comes to white people's ideas about Black people and how those ideas inform their political behavior. So if you think about the symbolic racism literature, right, it's fundamentally about how white people's ideas about Black people affect their policy preferences and attitudes. We don't actually do the same thing with Black people, right? We don't really have a very good sense of how Black people's ideas of Black people inform their behavior, their political behaviors. And so I argue that, a fully realized study of Black political behavior requires attention to that. And in that sense, I don't think the approach I take is actually in conflict with the identity model at all. In fact, I think what I'm up to complements it and is sort of dependent on it in a lot of ways. I argue that we have to be more expansive in how we conceptualize race, for sure. But I don't think that it makes sense to abandon the notion of race as an identity. I think it actually exists as both. So attending to the meanings attached to race allows for a richer analysis of how Black interests are constructed, linked to specific social policies, and expressed through various political behaviors like policy framings and alliance building. And so accordingly, I think one of the things my research shows is that the link between Blackness and any particular political program can't be taken for granted, right? Like I said earlier, a lot of things can be done in the name of Black people, and arguably not all those things particularly good for Black people. Of course, that last statement is undermined by everything I said previously about who are we talking about when we talk about Black people. So I'm not lacking in self-reflection as a result of this project. But I also want to say that I think what I'm talking about here, this notion of thinking about social characteristics, not just as identities people have, but also as sets of meanings that people think about, right? So it's not just you don't just have identities, you also have thoughts about your identity. Applies to other groups too. Obviously, my case is talking about Black Republicans, and so I'm focused on Black race and Blackness more broadly. But I think you could do a similar sort of analysis with different racial and ethnic groups. I think you could do a similar analysis around gender or around class or sexuality, right? So I think hopefully what I'm doing here is offering up a broader way of conceptualizing how we think about identity in our analyses of political behavior. And so I'll stop there. Oh, thank you.